What you have here are another 10 short, less than 2-minute clips, all of these pertaining to critical thinking. Many of them asked of me while I was engaged in teaching and developing critical thinking classes for Fayetteville State University, where I used to teach several years ago. And all of these are coming from VYou, which was a social network that relied on users to record using their webcams, so not really high quality, record video responses to questions and comments. And so I asked my students in my critical thinking classes if they wanted to raise questions with me or explore the digital universe, if they wanted to try out VYou. And so quite a few of them did respond to the challenge, and so you get 10 clips here. Not all of these are actually coming from my own students. Some of these are coming from VYou users, but I would say a good 6 or 7 of these particular questions or comments came from my own classes.
Taught critical thinking in their earlier years of age? Yes, definitely. As a matter of fact, I think that if you don't, you're actually handicapping the kid, and that's why so many students come to my classes not knowing what kids 20, 30, 40 years ago would have known, and we have to do a lot of remedial work with critical thinking. I think it's partly because the educators themselves, K through 12, often don't have any notion of what critical thinking actually means, other than they think it means looking at things from different sides and asking questions. But critical thinking is a lot more than that. The focus on argument is really key. See, here's the thing. Throughout history, part of being an educated person meant studying argument after argument after argument, learning how to coherently express yourself, how to look at other people's arguments, which are often quite complex. I mean, just think about the argumentative structure in as simple as a document as a letter from a Birmingham jail, which apparently students don't read anymore. Martin Luther King assumed an audience that actually was educated well enough to follow arguments. And if you don't have that, it's just a lot of gobbledygook to you, with a few, pious sentiments thrown in. If you actually can look at arguments, and it takes a lot of practice to be able to do that, to be able to understand what an author is doing. If you can do that, then it opens up an entire world for you. The whole world of the humanities really depends on people being able to think, not just appreciate, but think. And so critical thinking, yeah, we ought to be teaching our kids that. It ought to be a deliberately infused part of the curriculum. Right now it's not. I don't know if that's going to change in the future. Yes, I think critical thinking should be taught in high school, and I think it should be taught in 2 different ways. I think that it should actually be taught as portions of a course, modules you might say, and I think that it should be infused into the curriculum in high school as well. One thing I find is that education people that I deal with, they have an understanding of critical thinking that does not match up to or measure up to what we philosophers actually mean by critical thinking. And if you want to know what critical thinking means, the best place to go is the American Philosophical Association Delphi report. And in other countries, actually, they do teach a lot of what we call critical thinking in their equivalents of high school. So I think that we ought to be doing that. I'm not sure how you would actually get it in there. It would take quite a bit of work, but I think that that's something that we really need, because one of the things I'm finding is students are coming into my critical thinking classes and they are just not prepared at all. So we have to do a lot of remedial work. So here's a question from one of my students. Do you think that critical thinking is mainly common sense? And the answer is no. I think that critical thinking and common sense are connected in very interesting ways. I'm going to try to be really short here. So here's what I have to say.
Critical thinking goes beyond common sense. It builds on it, and I think it presupposes it. But critical thinking as a discipline means the study of argumentation, learning how to analyze arguments. That means break them into their parts, how to evaluate them, tell whether they're good arguments or bad arguments, how to look to see whether premises or starting points of arguments are actually true or not, how to evaluate information sources. There's more to critical thinking than that, but you notice that goes beyond just common sense. And it goes beyond common sense because it presupposes it, but it also goes beyond it because there's certain methods. And common sense doesn't really have methods. I think that common sense is something that you really have to have some modicum of in order to be able to do any critical thinking. So here's another question, good question, about critical thinking and common sense. What is the difference between critical thinking and common sense? So when I thought about this, I came up with three. One is that critical thinking actually builds on common sense to some degree, and it codifies it and it extends it. So if you don't have some degree of common sense, the critical thinking might not do you quite that much good. But critical thinking goes beyond common sense. So that's one thing. Second one, notice you can have a critical thinking textbook. Do you have a common sense textbook? No, because common sense is sort of a set of habits that are built up situationally over time. Critical thinking can actually be taught because it consists in some techniques and concepts and procedures and definitions. That's why it's tied in with logic. Logic can be taught too. Third thing, common sense can't actually take stock of and explain itself. You have common sense, you use common sense. If somebody asks you what's common sense, you have a very difficult time saying what it is. Critical thinking can actually take account of itself and provide reasons why it makes the judgments it does. If you have common sense, you generally make the right determinations, right? But you can't say exactly why you can. You just say, well, that's common sense. With critical thinking, you should be able to give some sort of reason why something is a good argument or a bad argument. Well, it has this fallacy, or the premises are false. Notice what you're doing there goes beyond common sense. So I hope that helps.
So this is by one of my critical thinking students. Is it better to be a skeptical thinker or a critical thinker? That depends entirely on what you mean by skeptical. There's two main ways that I'm going to talk about here. So if you mean by skeptical, looking for evidence that's proportionate to the sort of claims that people are making, that's part of being a critical thinker. Actually, that should be something you're applying not only to other people, but also to yourself. So when you say to yourself, I should do this or I shouldn't do that, part of being a critical thinker is actually being skeptical of your own desires, responses, and that doesn't mean saying, hey, there can't be anything to them. It just means looking for some evidence, looking for some reasons for what you're saying. If you mean by skeptical the kind of person who doesn't believe anything and makes exorbitantly high demands for evidence from people that can't possibly be met, that's no good. You don't want that. So that's not being a critical thinker. And if that's what you mean by a skeptical thinker, I'd much rather see you be a critical thinker than a skeptical thinker.
Well, what am I supposed to do with this critical thinking now that I'm done with your class? My hope is that you'll continue with what you've learned in the class. This is, of course, assuming that you've actually put in the necessary work to have gotten much out of the class, which I would say only a third of my students do in any given semester. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to build upon the foundation that we worked with in the class. And you're supposed to extend it, and you're supposed to make this part of your set of tools, or you might think of it as part of the skeleton of your thought. There's a lot of areas in which critical thinking and the skills and the dispositions that it comprises, like, for instance, giving reasons that other people might find convincing for the claims that you're making, or looking for other people to give reasons similarly. That's a habit. That's not something that you just automatically grasp and start doing. You got to build that up as part of your repertoire, your way of communicating with other people, your way of being. I hope that you do build on it, because I think this stuff is really important, and I can pick out 4 main areas where it's critically important. One is in your other classes. You need to be able to make arguments, to look at other people's arguments, to evaluate information sources, to compare positions against each other, to give explanations for what's going on, and also to do some self-scrutiny so that you can improve. Politics is another really important area where you have to apply critical thinking. And the marketplace, as a consumer, you need to be able to apply critical thinking. And then your personal life. A lot of arguments that people get into, when you look at them carefully, a lot of what therapists are actually doing is pointing out errors in critical thinking that their clients are making. So that's why it's important.
Do I think that students will use critical thinking after they've left my class? I know that some of them do, because I do have students who come up to me, and it'll be out of the blue. They see me on campus and they say, hey, that thing that we learned in your class, this topic, I ended up using it in another class, or I was watching the news and I realized that they weren't giving me the whole story because, or I was tempted to buy this product, but then I started looking closely at the advertisement and analyzing it. So I know that people are using some of the things after they leave the class. And a lot of the students have actually said that the focus on argument and being able to make arguments to compose them really helped them a lot in their writing in other classes. My hope, of course, as an educator, is that all the students continue to practice what we learn in the critical thinking classes. The reality is, I think most of the students actually just get through the class and then forget about it, which is terrible, because when it comes to voting, consuming, being productive members of society, they're at a disadvantage, and they're actually going to be a problem for their fellow citizens, family members. They're contributing to a marketplace where people are able to exploit each other very, very easily. Critical thinking is actually, you might say, kind of a duty for an educated person. So that's why we teach it. That's why it's a required class at Fayetteville State University. It's not in a lot of places. Should be required everywhere, but unfortunately it's not.
Well, of course, if you read your textbook on page 36, that's where it covered this, right? No, yeah, this is from one of my critical thinking students, and it's a very legitimate question. How does critical thinking prepare us for the world outside of college? And, I spend some of the class time talking about how what we're doing in the critical thinking class, which deals with building blocks of arguments, how to analyze arguments, how to evaluate arguments, how to look at larger arguments with information sources, how to evaluate them with issues of bias, informal fallacies, and then with some of the basics of inductive techniques of inductive reasoning. I often stress that this is really useful for your other classes, but that's a legitimate question. What good is this stuff once we actually get out of college? And I think that, if you look at the examples in my course lectures that I've put online for you guys, you notice that I give a lot of useful examples, not from other classes, but from real life, ranging from politics to products to things about stereotyping, personal relationships, all those sorts of things. Usually when we make bad choices, bad inferences, when we get into heated arguments with people, it's because some sort of failure of critical thinking has taken place. And it may not be right there in that there we go, right there in that argument that you're looking at, it may be in a larger context. And this actually, since I have a few seconds left, critical thinking is not just a set of techniques, it's not just a set of skills, it's not just knowledge, it's also dispositions. And that disposition to look at the larger context and to self-evaluate, that's really core to critical thinking. So, and that's important in life. What is a good deductive argument? Well, this one's actually very straightforward and simple to answer. A good deductive argument is one which is both valid and sound. So valid means that it has a good structure. The nice thing about deductive arguments is you can analyze them solely in terms of their structure if you want to, and that's what formal logic is all about. You can symbolize them with various symbols that we use, and with letters or any other kind of variables that you like, and you can look just at the form. And if the premises being true would lead to the conclusion being true, then it's valid. And there's a number of different techniques that we have that in my critical thinking class, unfortunately, since we didn't have the time, we didn't go into, but there are a lot of really quite interesting. I find them very interesting, and a lot of people in math and computer science find them very interesting as well. A lot of interesting techniques that you can use to analyze deductive arguments. The other part of it is it has to be sound, which means that the premises actually have to be true. Now, determining whether premises are actually true, that's a bit different than just looking at the structure of things. Sometimes that means actually looking at the world or comparing what you know in your background knowledge or in your field of expertise with the claims that are being made. So yeah, that's what it takes. It just has to be valid and sound. This is the most interesting critical thinking question yet that I've been asked. Does writing music require critical thinking skills? And the answer is no. You don't need argument or the ability to distinguish claims from each other, or concerns about information sources or things like that, and credibility to write music. But you do, in fact, need some of the same basic dispositions that you would need in order to be a critical thinker, in order to write music well. You have to have persistence. You have to actually be willing to dig into the topic. Music is complex. Music theory, it really helps to know some mathematics in order to make sense of that. Not only do you have to have a good ear, you have to have a good brain. And so yeah, it doesn't require critical thinking skills per se, but it requires something that's in the same sort of family as critical thinking skills, I think.